Good evening, everyone, and thank you for coming. I'm Amanda Meusz, a member of the family team at Braverman Court Chambers. This is Rachel Braverman, who is the director of the in NVR Consortium. Right. Thank you for all of those who've braved the December air and who have not gone to other parts of the mic. So, and thank you, very large online contingent who's joining us. So, I just wanted really to let you all know how Rachel and I met. Rachel became involved in a direct access case that I was working on. I have permission from the client to share anonymised details of her case. So this mother had two children who it transpired had been sexually abused for a long period of time by their father. He did everything that one would expect a protective mother to do. She removed the father from the home and sought services and engaged with services for the benefit of her children. The younger child, who was at the time the father left the family home, started off fine, but gradually her mental health deteriorated and she started displaying really worrying and increasingly worrying behaviours. Whilst CAMS were involved, they did very little to assist. And the sorts of behaviours this young girl was displaying are the behaviours that all of you will know very well from the cases that we do. So her mood started to deteriorate. She stopped going to school as much. She started to self-harm. She took her first overdose just before the age of 12. She then started accessing cannabis and alcohol. CAMS continued to be involved, but did very little to assist the family. The father, in the meantime, was pressing for contact. The young person's behaviour continued to deteriorate. Services started to become involved and they blamed the mother for the child's behaviour, saying that the child was behaving in this way because of abusive parenting. The young person became increasingly dysregulated. There were more overdose attempts. She started being very violent to her mother, including attempts at strangling her mother and frequently holding knives and other implements to her mother's throat. CAMS recommended that when the child became dysregulated, that emergency services should be called. Each time emergency services were called, the child became more traumatised, dysregulated, and it started to impact on the relationship between the child and her mother. This young person started on roofs, threatened to jump from the top of rooftops. She would run out into the street, lying in embrace of oncoming traffic. The sorts of behaviours we very often see in our cases, and these sorts of behaviours very the child being placed in secure accommodation or deprivation of liberty after or during one episode, one particularly violent episode where the child broke down the door. A neighbour heard the commotion and called the police. By this time, the police were well and truly sick of being called out, and they decided to arrest this traumatised young girl who was 13 at the time. She was arrested at 3 p.m. in the afternoon and detained in police custody until 3 a.m. in the morning. He was told that she could not go home to her mother eventually, thankfully, she was released into the care of a family friend. So the trajectory and the outcome for this child and her family were looking very, very poor. And really, she was getting no assistance at all from the services that are supposed to be there to help. And the mother was certainly only being criticised by statutory services and by CAMS. At this point, after the child's arrest, the mother, I think, found Rachel, and Rachel started working with this mother, and I think within about 6 weeks, the really serious behaviours stopped. So the climbing on roofs, the extreme violence, the grabbing hold of knives, the attempt at strangulation. I think it's fair to say the problems didn't go away completely, but there's very, very extreme behaviours, these sorts of behaviours where we find children are locked up, stopped. And I think Rachel carried on working with the family for a year, something like that. Yep. And my understanding is that they are doing really well. So this was a very effective intervention, and something that I hadn't really ever seen before. I think the intervention work started about 2020 at the start of lockdown. What I have seen is that increasingly local authorities are becoming aware of MBR. Some of you guys are aware of MBR, and I know those of you who instruct me will often hear me saying, this is what I recommend in this particular case. Because the sorts of cases that are coming through my door are cases of 6 and 7-year-olds who are starting to smash up their toy boxes, becoming violent to their mother, father, caregivers, increasingly defiant, running away. And one can see when one looks at those sorts of behaviours that unless they're given the right assistance, one can see that they are going to go along the pathway of the many, many children that we see in our proceedings, who end up being removed, in foster placements, the foster placements break down, they end up in residential units, the child or young person becomes increasingly traumatised and dysregulated, and they end up either in secure accommodation or under a deprivation of liberty order. The other thing that we know, because I spent a great deal of time talking to psychologists at the Maudsley and in their trauma services, that they are increasingly seeing young people who have been so traumatised by the system, by the interventions put in place by CAMS, by their experience of either being in secure accommodation or being placed under a deprivation of liberty, trauma treatment for the trauma experienced in the system, as well as the trauma that caused them to start displaying dysregulated and challenging behaviours. So all of us doing this sort of work, we've seen the increase in children who are behaving in this way. Doing this work, to be becoming increasingly worried about outcomes for the children. We know that the judiciary are extremely worried. We know that the president of our family division is hugely worried. Because of the increase in deprivation of liberty cases, we all know that the National Dolls Court was set up. When I was in RET in the Court of Appeal in 2019, the president of the family division expressed concern that there were some 150 dolls applications being made that year. Now we know from the Northfield Family Justice Observatory Foundation and the work of Beverly Barnett Jones, who I think is joining us, that there are 1,300 dolls cases each year. So the situation is really dire for our young people and for families. So what I wanted to introduce you all to MVR in a more in-depth way. What I was hoping this short training will assist you with is when you have clients coming through the PLO process, you'll be able to identify clients, parents, carers who may benefit from MVR. When you, at the start of care proceedings, hopefully you'll be able to identify parents, families, caregivers who will benefit from this or who may benefit from this intervention. In my experience, and I don't know whether those of you are here have the same experience, so what we tend to see in the PLO process and in care proceedings is that parents are sent off to generic parenting work. So either something working for the years, P, circle of security, strengthening families, strengthening communities. So they'll either be told that that's what they need to do at the start of proceedings, or they will be told this is a good intervention for you in the PLO process. I don't know about your experience, but in cases, my experience anecdotally of parents who have been sent on those programs, parents who are dealing with these really challenging behaviours, is they will say to me, Amanda, it didn't work. It was no good for me. What use are sticker charts to me when my child is smearing poo over the walls and emptying his toy box and smashing all his toys? It didn't work. It wasn't helpful. I felt isolated and alienated in that group. And then, of course, what you get is social workers in their sweats saying, well, we sent the parent on this parenting intervention. It didn't work. The parent didn't make proper use of the intervention, didn't engage, didn't embed change. Therefore, what can we do? And I don't know about you guys. I see this over and over again. So I see some nods going on here. I despair because those sorts of interventions are fantastic for parents who need a bit of support and a bit of help, but they are not going to, in my view, help a parent who has a child who's experienced extreme trauma and who is displaying these really, really difficult behaviours. And my understanding additionally is that those reward consequence type parenting programs can be really counterproductive when you have a child who is, Rachel nodding, who is traumatised, and the traumatised child experiences the reward consequence type intervention as a further punishment and is traumatised some more. So not surprisingly, it doesn't work. Anecdotally, again, in my experience, what I observe is that parents are sent, or carers, or sent on the generic parenting programs. Those who find favour with the local authority are sent on PACE parenting programs, sometimes MVR. And the other current favourite seems to me is didactic parenting programs. Dyadic. And very often we see case notes from residential units where they say all the staff are trained in dyadic psychotherapeutic parenting. So dyadic psychotherapeutic parenting and PACE sort of go hand in hand, but they are very different from the generic Incredible Years, Triple P, Circle of Security type parenting, which focus on the child's experience and trying to unpick with the child what it's like to be that child and why it is in the child's is completely unable to regulate their emotions. And again, anecdotally, what I find is you go to court and the child is with a kinship carer or proposed special guardian. The proposed special guardian or the kinship carer has some helpful intervention, and what you get in the final evidence is, oh, well, look, the child is now flourishing in the care of the proposed special guardian or the kinship carer, and what an excellent job this parent is doing. But they have been given, in my experience, a completely different intervention, and so it's not surprising that they are doing much better. The introduction to this training did say that I was going to go through each different parenting intervention. I'm not going to do that. There are some slides. You can have them if you wish. There's a summary of each sort of intervention, which you may find useful. But I just wanted to give you that sort of overview of the different sorts of intervention that I experienced in my practice as barrister representing the most vulnerable and often seemingly the most thought to be the most hopeless clients, because things have become so difficult. So I've set out short summary of those interventions, and you can look at them or not. But the point was to explain the difference in those other programs. And of course, there's MVR, which really focuses on those challenging and harmful and terrifying behaviours. And I wanted to allow the bulk of this session to be taken over by Rachel, who does this wonderful training. And it's not going to train you to be MVR, it's hopefully going to help you identify when it would be useful.
So these are the slides that Amanda has prepared about the various different interventions. And I have to say, actually, I think they're very interesting. So I would really recommend that people do read them. I thought they were actually a really great summary. And first of all, I would like to say I'm so pleased to be invited to talk to people in the legal profession, because where we're coming from as parents is we're often seeing parents who are absolutely on their knees, are in court, about to lose their children. And part of MVR, a big part of MVR, is actually about creating networks of helpful help. So it's really great to be able to be talking to people who can be part of those networks. So first of all, thank you so much, Amanda, for inviting me. And before I get into MVR itself, I thought I'd share a little bit about my story, because I'm one of those parents. My partner and I adopted our son, who's now 19, when he was a toddler. And it became, although we were told that he didn't have any additional needs, of course he'd had a traumatic early start, because otherwise he wouldn't have needed to be adopted. He was quite young. We thought, great, absolutely lovely, gorgeous boy, still is. However, it became clear very early on that actually he had experienced a lot of trauma. He also had a lot of additional needs. He's got a whole range of diagnoses. You know, sometimes we kind of like play cards with it. It's like, okay, which one's going to get us the service today? But some of them are accurate. In particular, fetal alcohol syndrome has been the main issue, we feel, and along with things like sensory processing disorder. And again, seeing some else. So you've probably seen that kind of mix, which along with attachment issues. And he showed his distress in really extreme behaviours, and the kinds of behaviours that Amanda was describing, and that I think you've all seen, we saw in our family. And to cut really quite a long story short, we were taught, we planned to be therapeutic parents. We knew about PACE. That was what we were trying to implement. It's really hard to do when you are ducking and you're quite literally putting out fires. Actually, you know, and it's exhausting and it's tiring, and it affected our mental health. And we got to the stage, with all of the social capital that we had got to the stage where we could not manage anymore. And we were actually saying to our adoption support worker, he's going to have to go back into care, which, you know, I've told my story a lot of times and it still makes me choke up to think that, you know, that might have happened. And at that stage, he was 11. So it was that really tricky phase. He was about to go into secondary school. He just about managed, with our extremely sharp elbows, to remain in a mainstream school with a lot of help and so on. But he really was and danger of being excluded the whole time. We were just, at the end of the day, we weren't able to keep him safe. And that was the bottom line. We were not able to keep him safe. And our wonderful adoption support worker said, look, try NVR. And if I sound evangelical about NVR, it's because I am. It's because it absolutely saved our family. And we learned not how to modify his behaviour, because we tried everything we could. We'd done sticker charts, we'd done reward charts, we'd done therapeutic parenting, we'd tried absolutely no challenges at all. And it hadn't helped. And we were getting to the stage where, you know what, we loved our son dearly, we didn't like him very much sometimes. So, and also we were becoming really ill. It's really hard to do this. So we did NVR and it made a huge difference. And I can say that we've had an awful lot of ups and downs since then, because one thing that NVR will not do is it will not cure a disability. It will not cure fetal alcohol syndrome. It will not in itself suddenly magically heal trauma. It does allow healing from trauma to happen, and it creates that space, but it doesn't of itself. So we've still had our challenges, and NVR has seen us through lockdown, which actually was quite good for us because we just hunkered down and ignored anything to do with education. But coming out of lockdown, my son went in at 15, came out at 17, like a cork coming out of champagne bottle. And because of his difficulties, he'd always really struggled with being sociable and making relations with his peers. We live in an area of London where there are lots of, and again, I'm sure that you will have, this was probably not the most unfamiliar story to you. Some people saw, aha, a vulnerable young man approaching. And in no time, he was getting involved in gangs, he was getting involved in drugs, criminal justice system, and you can imagine where this was going to go. But with NVR, actually enabled, it felt like we were playing tug of war sometimes. So, you know, we were trying to pull him away from all these people who were trying desperately to pull him the other way. We won. In October, I think it was October, November, about 2021, we had the police out 38 times in a month, which was quite a lot. But you know what? He was never arrested. Eventually, he's, because of the amount of weed he was smoking, he started to become quite paranoid. And we ended up in hospital, but he was not sectioned. It was an absolute miracle. And it's a very long story, so I'm not going to go into the whole of it. But eventually, he did have to move out from us. And so he did end up on a Section 20 because we needed to keep him safe, and we needed to keep him safe from the people around him. But we remained his parents throughout all that. We were able to help him to a place of safety where he could start to thrive. All was great. We then re-met his birth mother, which sort of on his 18th birthday, found her on Facebook. And that then led to another mental health issue. So he decided he was going to go live with her. We still kept hanging on. NVR enabled us to keep hanging on through all of that, through him being homeless for a little while. He's now currently in really quite close to his birth mother. So we've been able to scaffold that relationship as well as keep the relationship with us going. He's now in a place where he has supported housing. He's got a decent package of care from sexual services, which is extraordinary, I have to say. And it's all been the fact that we've been able to keep this relationship with him, because so many times it felt as if we were going to lose him. It felt like there were so many things that were trying to tug him apart. But thanks to the approach that we use that has consistently helped us, we keep going, we keep going, we keep going. And talk to him every day. He's still my lovely boy. He is the funniest thing, you know. He's just a delight. He's not been a menace. It was NVR that was the start of it, and it enabled us to be playful. It enabled us to be accepting, all of those things. So that's a little bit about my story. There always this amazing approach that I'm so evangelical about. So it's a parenting approach for families experiencing problematic behaviours in their children, and we do talk about it very much as an approach. A lot of the other parenting programmes are, you do this and then you do that, and it's quite mechanistic. NVR is based on a series of principles that work together, build or rebuild the parent-child relationship, and that's what's absolutely central. It's about building that relationship, because the theory, where there is attachment, where there is liking and connection and communication, where the child can thrive, that's when they can change their behaviour. So it addresses children and young people's violent, destructive and harmful behaviours. Crucially, and this is really, really one of the most helpful things, is it teaches parents to change their own reactions to their child's behaviours. Parents who go on NVR courses, you do not have to get the child to engage at all, which is definitely different from a lot of the other parenting courses. And for most of the parents that we see, one of the big problems is that their children will not engage, or they're actively trying to pull themselves away in various ways. It's very much trauma informed. The underlying view is that the behaviours that the children and young people are displaying, they are means of communication. The trouble is, they're really unhelpful ways of communicating distress, and they're not actually effective. Because of course people are reacting to all of the difficult behaviours with alarm. They're not designed, these behaviours, to go in with compassion. It's very much a systemic programme. It considers the whole family, which I find really, really helpful. And very often when I'm teaching NVR, we usually start off with what we call the index child. So that's the child that the parents find about. But where there are siblings, nearly always you're talking about the sibling, what's happening with the siblings. Are they young carers, for example? Is one family where we had one child who was very explosive, but it was the other child who was winding them up. Sadly, we do see cases where we have sibling abuse, all sorts of things that are going on. We have families with lots and lots and lots of children as well. And again, I'm sure that these are the sorts of families that you're yourselves also representing a lot of the time. One of the things also that I really like about NVR is it's not NVR or, it's very often NVR and. So it actually behaviours with alarm. They're not designed, these behaviours, to go in with compassion. It's very much a systemic programme. It considers the whole family, which I find really, really helpful. And very often when I'm teaching NVR, we usually start off with what we call the index child. So that's the child that the parents find about. But where there are siblings, nearly always you're talking about the sibling, what's happening with the siblings. Are they young carers, for example? Is one family where we had one child who was very explosive, but it was the other child who was winding them up. Sadly, we do see cases where we have sibling abuse, all sorts of things that are going on. We have families with lots and lots and lots of children as well. And again, I'm sure that these are the sorts of families that you're yourselves also representing a lot of the time. One of the things also that I really like about NVR is it's not NVR or, it's very often NVR and. So it actually opens a space up where the other therapeutic interventions can work. So DDP will work much better. That where parents and children need trauma therapy, not always, but sometimes they can actually work in tandem. And it can open that space where children are much more able to engage with things that are really going to heal those really deep wounds. So here is some of the hope for NVR. It reduces feelings of parental helplessness, hopelessness, and powerlessness. And from what's going on inside, from what they've been told from outside, that's where parents often start. It restores parental authority. And by that, I do not mean that we're going to turn all parents into stern Victorian, Mr. Gradgrinds and people like that. Not at all. But it's about that sense that, I'm the parent. I'm in charge. It's my job to keep you safe. And that's what we enable parents to do, to be able to step up to the plate and be parents. It fosters caring and respectful relationships, not just within the family, but also with wider communities. And of course, this is so often where you guys are coming in, particularly when we're thinking about the criminal justice system. And the fact of the matter is, a lot of the children are committing criminal acts. So that's really, really tricky journey from victim to perpetrator. That's happening all the time. Absolutely crucially, it increases the child's sense of safety. When children feel safe, that's when their systems can calm, that's when their systems can regulate, that's when they can climb down from the high places, when they can put down the knives, when they can stop biting and spitting and hitting and swearing, when they feel safe, when they feel heard. And that's what NVR enables parents to be able to do, to hear their children and to keep them safe. So just some examples of it's a really wide range of behaviours. When NVR was first developed, it was really focusing on violent behaviours. But in fact, as time has gone on, we've realised that actually it can be used with a whole range of behaviours. So violence, dangerous behaviours. So the climbings up on high, in our particular case, the doing wheelies down the middle of main roads, those sorts of behaviours. Self-harm. which I think is often a surprise because we're often very used to thinking about externalizing behaviours, but actually NVR can be really helpful with internalizing behaviours as well. Eating disorders, there is an NVR organisation that specialises in helping parents with children with eating disorders. School refusal, that's a biggie. Absconding in all sorts of ways, gang involvement, all of these sorts of behaviours NVR has proved really effective with. And just to say also, it's very adaptable as well. One of the things about that can happen with some of the other parenting interventions, it's like they're quite rigid. Because NVR is based around principles, and what happens is you explain the principles and then you say, okay, let's see how this principle is going to be enacted in your family, in your particular situation, with the particular children you've got, with the particular history that you're bringing with you. The earliest that we usually think of NVR is when the children are around 4 up to adulthood. In fact, actually, the oldest child whose parents I'm seeing at the moment is 32. So you can use this with the whole range. And there are, in fact, NVR organisations that specialise in adults who are failure to launch. So there's not really an upper age limit. When there's neurodiversity in children and in their parents, and that's one of the things that we're increasingly seeing, actually, I don't know if this is just our organisation getting, the word's getting around, or whether that's something that's happening in general, but we're seeing more and more parents who are neurodiverse, parents who may have learning disabilities, and actually NVR is very adaptable for them as well. And in fact, actually, I think it's particularly helpful where there's neurodiversity, because those tend to be the children for whom the rewards and consequences parenting is just pretty meaningless. So it doesn't work. Where parents are not living with their child, and again, this is really helpful, I think, for some of the cases which you'll be seeing where children have already left the family or where the parents are trying to get them back. And all types of family makeups, so adoptive families, foster families, special guardians, single parent families, people who are co-parenting after a relationship breakdown. It's adaptable to all of those. I think that's the thing I'm trying to say. It really is a very adaptable modality. We've also seen it with one of the questions that's often asked is, if you have a child who's really has severe learning disabilities, we've also worked with parents where children are non-verbal. So it can work with that. I mean, yeah, of course, you have to make a lot of different adaptations, but you can do it and it works really well. So I'm going to show you. So this is kind of what we teach parents, but I'm going to do it in, like, I hope, 5 minutes. At the centre of our map, this is our NVR map, you have parental presence and rebuilding or building the relationship. What we are aiming for in NVR is to build the relationship between parent and child, which has so often been fractured. Sometimes it's been fractured because of the children's behaviour. Sometimes the children's behaviour is telling you about the fractures that have happened elsewhere, but that's the result. That relationship is going to tend to have been undermined for all sorts of reasons. So everything that we do is aimed at building that relationship, because when the relationship between the parent and child is healed or is improving, that's when the child can feel safe enough to change their behaviour, and they will in response. So we talk about parental presence. That's this feeling that, I'm your parent, I'm here, I'm not going to go away and leave you. Although, of course, for a lot of children, that's exactly what they've experienced. And then we think about how parents communicate with their child, and what the children's perspective and needs are. So it's very much about sort of thinking, trying to mentalise that our children, which some parents find very, very hard. So you might be surprised to learn that where we start is looking after yourself, prioritising self-care. Because when you think about all these other sort of modalities, say, you're going to do, I remember once being sort of told, what you need to do is an hour special play with your son every evening. I think that's exhausted. I can manage 2 minutes to do the washing up. I'm doing pretty well. So we always start off with self-care. You can't pour from an empty cup. And actually, the kinds of parenting that we're asking parents to do, it's more difficult. We talk about Olympic parents, and all Olympians do a lot of training. So self-care is the way that parents train in order to be able to parent in these very difficult cases. A lot of the principles you'll have found elsewhere, but there's like an NVR slant on it. So our slant on it, on looking after yourself, is this isn't a nice to have. It's essential, because it's not because this is how you parent. This is how you make sure that you have the resources in order to do so. And it's not, I'm not going to go into too much detail, but it isn't just about taking a nice hot bath. It's about things like, have you been to the doctors? Are you taking care of your health? Are you making sure that you have social contact? Are you taking care of your emotions if you need to go to therapy? So it's a very kind of muscular thing. Then this is the bit which actually people really want to start with, but actually I don't think it's quite hard to de-escalate until you've got the strength for it. But it's, how do you de-escalate those really difficult situations calmly and responding? We talk about when the iron is cold and helping parents to do that. By the way, one of the things about NVR is it's quite easy to explain, it's really hard to do. And that's part of what we do, is to support people actually to do it. And making small gestures of unconditional loving kindness. Do you know what? Try it with your children and your friends and your colleagues. It's magic for creating relationships. So that's why we start with these, what we call our core three. Then baskets is simply parents pick their battles. Often there, and you may have had, one of the things I find really, really tricky in things like child in need conferences is parents are told you've got to change this and this and this and this, is about 20 things. And you sort of think, how on earth is anybody supposed to be able to do that? Actually, what we say is, no, we're going to work on the really, really serious stuff first, the one or two really serious behaviours first. And that's not that the others aren't important, it's just they're going to have to wait. And because actually trying to do everything all at once isn't working. It's not a moral thing, it's just, it doesn't work. And then parents supporters is a really important concept. Parents develop a robust support network so that they can get helpful help on the NVR journey. And we help parents to work out who's there, what tasks they need to be done, what is actually going to be helpful. Because often what's offered as help is not that helpful, as Amanda was saying. And that, it's often, so you might have families where there's been generations of, for example, physical chastisement. We would not consider it. So the person who says, I'll support you, but what you need to do is give your child a good slap. We would not consider that to be helpful help. It's an example. So that's what we call our nurturing side of NVR. However, NVR is also about, you know what? These behaviours do have to change. They're not okay. We may be able to understand where they come from, but they do have to stop. They're dangerous for the child. They're dangerous for the parents. They're dangerous for society. It's not okay. So we have a firmer side as well. So there's the announcement and sit-in. And the announcement is parents actually write an announcement, written announcement to their child, explaining their love and care for them, their resisting and priority behaviours. And the general message is, you, child, can be the agent of change. I, your parent, am going to do everything I can to support and help you. We are in this together. And that's a very, very important message. And I think that kind of connection is really important. And I think actually quite different from a lot of the other parenting interventions. And then it'd be lovely if, you write your child a letter and then they say, okay, Peter, I'm now going to behave absolutely perfectly from now on, but it doesn't really happen. So along with that goes a sit-in, which is really where parents will create a reflective space where they can think with their child, okay, what are some solutions? Again, we can be the agents of change here, containing that hope. And then finally, just so far I've been sort of talking about the parents and the child, and this does happen for the whole family. So that's like kind of whistle-stop tour of what we introduce to parents. As I said, it's pretty easy to understand. I can explain it in an introduction fairly easily. It's really hard to implement because some of what we're asking parents to do is counter biology. Your body is going to want to get in there and to do the fight. That's what we do. If we're faced with somebody who's in our face, either we will run away or we want to hit back. It's counterintuitive. A lot of the time I was thinking, really? You've got to be joking. But there's nothing like desperation for giving things a go, I'll tell you. It's also counter society because things like rewards and punishments are seen as the way to go. That sometimes NVR can be seen as if you are letting them get away with it. Really isn't. It's just that you are going to choose not to deal with something at a point where there's no point in it because your child is totally dysregulated. But it can seem counter society, which can be a problem for families where some of that society is the people that they're surrounded by, professionals and family and friends as well. It's really worth doing. Don't take my word for it. There is evidence. I've put a link there because I think these slides are going to go out. So if you're interested in evidence, Chaim Omer is the professor in Tel Aviv in Israel who first developed NVR, and he's got a great site where he adds to all the research as it's coming out. It's not. I think there should be a lot more research, particularly in what happens long term, but there isn't yet. However, what there is has shown that the impact on parents, that there are improvements in parental self-efficacy. Once you believe that you can do it, it makes it so much more likely that you will be able to do it. Reduction in parental helplessness, and I think that's one of the big things that we find is that parents just feel so overwhelmed by all of these factors. They're just, I can't parent. And yeah, so improves in parental helplessness and so on. Impacts on the children, improved overall emotional, psychological and social functioning. And this is the bit, of course, that everybody comes in. Reduction in externalizing and internalizing challenging behaviours. And that of course, is what everybody is really looking for. But there's all these other things that happen as well, actually. Studies with follow-up data also indicate that the positive results are maintained. There's not enough research into this, actually, I don't think. But there is a little bit that's suggesting that actually it's sustainable, which of course is really important. I don't know what the research incidentally is for the other interventions, that it might be true for them as well. So I hope I've convinced you that this might be quite a helpful intervention that you might want to ask for. So what might you think about if you want to refer a family for NVR training? First of all, this might sound quite a strange thing to ask yourselves, but are the children actually displaying problematic behaviours? Because sometimes known where it's like the child has actually been scapegoated and the problem isn't actually child's behaviours, it is the parents. And I would be sort of saying, no, actually, occasionally we sort of say, well, you know what, actually, you know, them having a slightly messy room isn't a problem. That is not a behaviour of concern. So first of all, just check that it's actually about problematic behaviours. Sometimes we have a phrase, right course, wrong time. Because although I've said that NVR is really helpful where there is trauma and that it can be used in parallel, sometimes parents are so overwhelmed and they're finding things so difficult that actually they do need to do some work on themselves first. Or it may be that there's a real emergency situation. I had a client recently and we were working, it was working really well, but then their child got ill and it's just like, do you know what, it's not working. They just need to care for their child. Hospital, you know, so we're just putting that on hold for now. So that might be another case where perhaps NVR, right course, wrong time. Also, we would be very, very wary of working on NVR with one parent where who is still in a domestic violence situation, because actually that could just escalate a perpetrator. So again, there are things that you'll need to think about. Is it actually the right time to do this? The next really crucial, important point is, do parents accept that the change starts with them? They don't have to be 100% convinced of this, I have to say, but a little bit, that they have to be prepared to change, or at least give it a go. Because very often parents will say, it's not me, it's my demon child. We don't need a huge, I think there's a bit of debate. Personally, I've often found that if we start off with self-care, sometimes that really unblocks a parent to be able to think about their child, because actually what's been happening is that they haven't been heard. And people have been berating them and they've gone into that place where they sort of say, well, yes, but, you know, but I'm being hit and it's awful and it's horrible. And they need somebody to sort of say, yeah, no, that is really difficult and terrible. But it's still, you know, you're still the grown-up though. You're still the one who's going to have to make the change. But actually, parents do have to accept at least it's a little bit of a level that they're going to change. In couples, are the parents on the same page? It really often happens that they're not. So I'm not saying that it's totally impossible, but it might be something that you'll want to kind of talk through exactly how it might work. We very often have worked with parents where one parent has been keen on NVR and the other hasn't. Sometimes we've had the delightful experience that we've, say, had one parent on one of our courses, and then a couple of courses down the line we've had the other one because they've been convinced that actually it has worked, which is really nice. Sometimes one parent is doing it despite. Again, thinking about what other interventions might be offered at the same time. And that's not to say, again, that you can't use NVR with other things. It's just something to be mindful of if you're looking at a package of care. Thinking about issues around disability, language, literacy, and so on. Thinking about whether a client might benefit from group or individual sessions. I would suspect that for most of the people that you will be working with, we're thinking about individual sessions because of the complexity of the cases. But not necessarily always, and I wouldn't rule out groups because for some families particularly, that feeling that you're not alone, that you're not the only person who's experiencing this is so magic, and that often the courses are great because one parent will share their story, another person will come, oh, yeah, that's happened to me. They're already creating a supportive group. So don't dismiss groups, but I would say probably because we're thinking of like complexity with you guys, you're probably going to be thinking more individuals. And then you'll be thinking about how many sessions might be appropriate. Again, thinking about complexity from all of the above. Yeah, we've got to think about the money. I'm afraid to say it's not free. It is on the cheaper end. It's certainly a lot cheaper than a lot of levels of individual therapy is. As I was coming up I was talking to my partner on the bus, and she commented to me, she said, "You do realise you probably saved the local authority about £1.5 million. So there may be an argument that this is could save the public purse apart from anything else. So just to finish off, this is what, so that's NVR in general. We're not by any means the only organisation that's offering NVR. We offer all our services online. We went online in the pandemic, and we've never come off because basically we can reach people all over the UK and abroad sometimes as well. But this is what our offer is. So one of the things that you might find is really helpful if you have a parent and they're not sure whether this is for them, we do fortnightly introductions, 2-hour introduction sessions where parents can find out a bit more about NVR, really make a decision on whether it's something they think would help them, and they can go away with some tools that they can implement straight away just from that introduction session. So that's often a very good way in. Then we offer courses for parents. We offer 3 courses every term. Usually one of them is like a general call, one for parents of children with additional needs. And then this time we're actually offering one for foster carers specifically, but we also offer them for adoptive parents as well, because sometimes their issues are quite different. Although I have to say, on our general courses, we usually find that there's a lot of neurodiversity in those courses as well. And then, of course, we offer individual sessions. We also offer training for practitioners. So if you come across any social workers or family support workers you think might benefit, send them our way. And this is our contact details.
Thank you.
So that's it. I think I've probably taken way too long.
No, thank you, Rachel. So whilst you're there, Rachel,
Yeah.
and we know about your organisation, but am I right in thinking that now, well, I know that you've trained social workers, certainly in North London, in Islington, maybe Camden, not Camden, but so,
I think.
and I know you've trained workers at the Tavistock as well.
Yeah.
So there are increasingly local authorities who have access to their own NVR resources as well. So you might think about when you're in the PLO process, asking for that sort of intervention as opposed to a generic parenting course. I think you've told us you wouldn't recommend NVR if a parent is still in an abusive relationship.
Yeah.
And they are determined that the only person to change is the child.
Although, I mean, that's true, certainly, but then you can often do some pre-work.
Because we often get that as lawyers, parents will typically say to you, asking for help, I want my child to be assessed for ADHD. I want my child to be assessed for this, that, and the other, thinking that if they get a magic diagnosis, then you can work on that diagnosis and the child's behaviour will be cured. These parents are, in my experience, also saying, I really want help. They see the way of getting help is to get a diagnosis from parents. And what do we do with, are they hopeless? Or
No, I don't think I don't believe in hopeless parents. I would say again that there's pre-work to be done. So it might be around, well, some of it is about some logic, one of which being that, well, NVR can help lots and lots of families where there is neurodiversity, with or without a diagnosis, when we have our courses specifically for parents with additional needs, we don't ask for a formal diagnosis for the very practical reason that we all know how hard it is to get a diagnosis these days anyway. So we just sort of think, fine, if you think there's neurodiversity, that's fine for us. So one of the things, again, might be to sort of say to the parents, look, why don't you come on one of the introduction sessions, just see. I also wonder if sometimes it's that parents feel so overwhelmed by what's happening, they can't imagine themselves as the agents of change anyway. Somebody else has got to rescue me because this is just beyond me. I have no evidence for that. That's just my feeling.
Most of our parents, or a lot of our parents, have come through the system. They've taken care of themselves and been traumatised themselves. So, does anyone have any questions?
That's right.
Yeah, sort of on that track, actually. So you talked about it being a trauma-informed practice, and thank you very much for your talk. It was really, really interesting. But as Amanda was just picking up on, so there's the trauma that the parents themselves may have experienced, the trauma that the child may have experienced, maybe at the hands of those parents, maybe from someone, a different caregiver. How is that integrated in terms of the training?
Okay, so one of the things that we do, first of all, is actually to talk about it and to acknowledge that it is something that might be, for example, we talk a lot about triggers. When you're looking at escalations, you look at what's going on underneath the escalation. It's like, why is this child, for example, going from 0 to 100 because they hear a certain song? One of the questions you can ask of a parent is, why does this particular behaviour that to somebody else might not seem such a big deal, why is that particularly making you on edge? Have you got to the stage where you're, what's happening with you physically? Thinking about so one of those ways is to think about the triggers. We also talk about things like, for example, window of tolerance. We all thrive and function well. And for people who have experienced trauma, parents and children, I mean, we tend to look at it more from the child's point of view, but it's also true for parents. That window can be really, really tiny. And part of what NVR is about very, very gently expanding that window of tolerance. Rather than sort of saying, okay, yeah, it's really small, we're going to keep it small, we're going to shrink it. It's like, no, this can grow. I'm going to help you. It can happen, it can happen, but it's got to happen in small steps. It's got to happen gradually. That's another thing. NVR can often happen over time, and I know that's a real problem when you're in court.
I know other people have questions too, but since I'm here, you said that the amount of sessions vary depending on the circumstances, but on average, how often do you work?
It really is very variable. What we usually say is, and it so much depends on funding, but we would start off with 10 sessions, a 90-minute one to start with, and then 9 others. That's like a kind of standard, but very often we'll need more, particularly where you've got very complex cases and you kind of like open up a whole can of worms, or, you were doing wonderfully with one child and then, oh, look, the other child has decided that they can now actually stop masking and start communicating their distress. So very often happens, and for some families, probably not the families that you'll be helping. Do you know what, 4 or 5, and they've got it? They really do. I think partly it depends on things like parents' own experience, how serious the behaviours are, or also all the other things that are going on around, like if there's lots of financial difficulties, or you're trying to do this when you're sleeping 3 to a bed, those sorts of things. So I'm afraid piece of string.
So the sort of cases we all do, I imagine, in your little blocks of 7 behaviours: the violence, dangerous behaviours, self-harm, school refusal, absconding and gang involvement. Not so much eating disorders, but we tend to get cases where all of that is going on. So a young person is being violent, is climbing on the roofs, lying in the street, self-harming, taking overdoses. In virtually all the cases, school attendance is under 70% and declining, and the running away. So are you saying that you would just focus on one of those behaviours at a time?
This sounds really contentious, but actually, yes. And you would basically, when we do our baskets exercise, it's a risk analysis. You look at the behaviours. What is the most risky behaviour? And usually if there is violence, it's usually the violence. Of course, it can sometimes be the absconding because it depends where the child is going. If they're disappearing around the corner to a mate's, you're possibly not so worried about it. If a child is going and prostituting themselves, you're very worried about it. So again, this is why it's a principle rather than being formulaic, because it very much depends on what's going on for that family, for that child. What's the most risky? It can be quite hard. Oh, sorry, yes.
So there's a process of analysis initially of the family, and then analysis of what is the most important thing that you address. But what's the, I mean, is it a therapeutic based approach? I'm trying to understand how you get to the point where you modify, you teach a parent modification, which then teaches the child the modification of behaviours. That's my assumption. What's the model based on? Does it have a therapeutic base?
Yes, it started off from family therapy. So Braverman was a family therapist, and so he's taken it from. What he did was actually he looked at NVR in the political arena actually, and realised that actually a lot of the time children's behaviour can seem very, very oppressive, and that actually parents needed to resist that, and that often they were finding that very difficult. And then he kind of brought that into an arena and sort of looked at family therapy, looked at the system, and realised this is where he saw it depends on the relationship. So that's where the therapeutic part comes in. It's focusing on the relationship. So all the things that we're doing, actually, until you come to the firmer part, everything that you're doing is in fact all about building the relationship.
The MVR practitioners, their training. What is that training?
Oh, right. So in that sense, no, I'm not a therapist. I am not a therapist. And I have to be sometimes have to be very, very clear. And I end up saying to it's like, I very often will suggest to parents that some therapy would be very helpful for them. But I'm not a therapist. We talk about it as an approach. It's about training. And so there's an organisation called NVR UK, which accredits course. So it is actually much more training. So it's much more along the lines, in that sense, it has more in common with things like triple. We're not pretending to be therapists.
Yeah.
However, to complicate matters, lots of therapists, however, use NVR in their practice.
Right. Okay.
Particularly those who are doing systemic work.
Dyadic practitioners use NVR quite a lot. Right.
It seems to go really well with that.
Yeah.
And with pace.
And with pace. Yeah. Oh, hi. Thanks.
I was just wondering, it's sort of like two questions in one. I was wondering what the cross-cultural reception of NVR has been, and if there's actually statistics or a report on that. Then the second part's more practical, is that we have a lot of clients where they don't speak English, and how especially finding that network of helpful help has been, or is it possible for our clients who don't speak English?
Absolutely, it is. And it's just, what I would say is, we have to be honest about this, that actually, particularly where people are new into this country, don't speak English and don't have many connections, it is really hard. And we really have to work with clients to absolutely think outside the box. And none of this is like an instant fix. And sometimes it is about kind of, right, okay, have you talked to your doctor? Okay, maybe we need to help you, maybe what you need to do is get to your GP. Is there a carers organisation for perhaps that might help? Is there somebody from your community? Do you have a spiritual practice or a religious practice and work like that? And in terms of, from the practical point of view of somebody who doesn't speak English, well, we would work with interpreters. And I mean, what would be wonderful, of course, is if we could then train the interpreters in VR. I think we have one person that we had on our courses. I would say that it's one of the considerations when we have courses, we've tried working with interpreters on courses, but unfortunately the person who's needs the interpretation kind of misses too much. So we'd say, actually, no, you need to do individual sessions in that case. Similarly, actually, if a parent has quite significant learning disabilities, actually, it's really, that we would say, actually, your individual sessions would be more appropriate. Incidentally, has there been any research on cross-cultural? No. As far as I know, and it's something that, it really should be explored. I don't think there's been nearly enough research on this anyway. This one has a question at the back.
Yeah, because of the kind of work we're in the kind of court cases and things where children are being taken into care or that. Do you accept referrals whilst they're going through that course?
We do. We wouldn't normally take people on our courses for that because they're too complex. And actually, I was going to talk about a couple of cases where, in fact, one case in particular I can remember where they were in court and absolutely having huge battles, and the child did remain in the family. It was very gratifying. I found the email where she told me, and Mum told me about that, which is really nice. So yes, we do. I would say, by the way, I think often CAMS departments don't. And this is one of the advantages that we have as a kind of just a CIC. We can set our own ground rules.
Do you do any kind of report back to the court, or would you expect that really that's something that comes from speaking to the social worker?
Usually we'd say that was speaking to the social worker. I think we would be open to it, but we would have to be really careful, because one of the things that we don't want to do is to be involved in policing. That's not our role. And I think once you start getting into reports, it's like, oh, how well did the parent engage? And it's like,
I was just wondering, when you were talking about how you sort of risk assess and decide which basket you're going to focus on first. Again, often in the sort of cases we've got that there's all of these issues going on, and you will have a local authority saying to well, you need to address these. Have you got any experience of how local authorities have reacted when, you know, the parent then said, well, I'm focusing on this because we've got to one thing at a time?
Can I be really honest? It's really hard sometimes. I wish I could say, oh no, this is the magical cure, and people are going to go see the light. Unfortunately, they don't always. And sometimes some of the risk, of course, is you have to take that into account. Incidentally, when we're talking about risk analysis, it's not us, the trainers, who are doing that risk analysis. It's very much encouraging the parents to do that, the exercises for them to identify it. Of course, with support and help, because it's like, well, one example is, again, thinking about domestic violence, where somebody's experienced domestic violence and has escaped from that. Sometimes I've had parents who sort of say, well, it's okay for them to hit me, but I don't want them to do this. And it's like, actually, you know what? You're not going to be a punchback. Actually, it's not okay. Can we have another think about this? So there's a little bit of side. What I have found that we can do that's helpful, and again, it comes really under this principle of supporters, is we can help talk to the social workers and explain about NVR. And you know how it is that sometimes when I had the hat on of being a parent, nobody would listen. But when I come in there as an NVR trainer on behalf of somebody else, then they'll listen. This is being recorded. Can we scrub that?
I'm familiar with nonviolent communication. Is that a methodology used within nonviolent resistance? Is it a similar approach in terms of the way you listen for intentions and those sorts of things?
It's a similar approach, actually. So it comes from that same route, which is about really wanting to listen and finding different ways of making sure that people are really heard, but they're not the same, if you see what I mean. I think it's another thing that actually works very well with NVR, actually, if parents are interested in doing that.
Thank you. Well, we've, as promised, unless there are any more questions, we've got some drinks and festive nibbles downstairs. So please come and join us and carry on the conversation.
I did have a question online. It's Neil Howarth with McCormack Solicitors. Thank you for a fascinating talk. I'm acting for a father at the moment. His 14-year-old daughter at risk of child sexual exploitation, frequent absconding. She was under adults and is trying to transition back into mainstream education under an increasing programme of contact between the parents, aiming for staying in contact over Christmas. Now, they are working with a family therapist. Would you be able to liaise with the family therapist to sort of tailor the NVR for both of them? Because I think they would really benefit from developing the strategies themselves to help using the programme to deal with this child's behaviour, please.
Yes, yes, and that's certainly something that we could do to absolutely liaise with the family therapist. Whether or not the family therapist would feel that would work, with I think that's a bit of it depends. But
yeah,
certainly the conversation is absolutely worth having, because it may work really, really well.
And Rachel,
I would I would talk to the parents first, and then if they're willing, I would then suggest it to the local authority and family therapist so there can be a discussion about it. But I want the parents to look at your website and have a think about it themselves first to see, because they might find it very helpful, because I think what they're finding difficulty with is trying to understand that it's in their hands, as it were, to alter the behavior in future, and this could provide them with the tools to help them to develop the insight to do that.
I think that's right. I know from my case that Rachel has worked with CAMS and with the Lighthouse, which is an organisation that works with children who've been sexually abused, and has worked holistically with the family, with local CAMS and the Lighthouse. So if other practitioners are willing to engage, I think it's completely doable and really useful to then have that team. I know in our practice we call it the team around the child, but really useful to have all those people coming together and working on addressing those really difficult behaviours and not reacting in the way that you feel tempted to react instantly. So if you've got a child who's run out into the middle of the road and is lying down, then I guess your reaction as a parent is to scream and shout and call the police and call the ambulance. And what did we say, Rachel, in our case? The mother just went and stood in the road and stopped the
traffic, which is amazing.
So classic example of MVR reminds me always of those protesters on the bridge at Selma. So there are ways of dealing with those really dangerous behaviours that don't escalate the behaviour and expand the trauma.
And also to say that there is a specific part of NVR called Campaign of Concern and Tailing, which specifically addresses issues where children are getting themselves into those very difficult situations, getting into gangs, into prostitution and those sorts of things, where actually the parents put themselves in danger. So that can be quite a helpful aspect of it.
Thank you very much for that. I enjoy your drinks. I'm going to have a cup of tea.
I've got 4 questions, so I'm going to ask them. I've now just worked out how to do this. So it's a question from Maud Davis, who is a family solicitor, represents children a lot. She asks, it would be helpful to know if the MVR approach could be used when children are in foster care or in residential care, with parents as well as carers involved. Yeah. I know the answer to that, Maud, but I'm going to let Rachel answer that.
It's because it's simply, absolutely. And in fact, we work with a lot of foster carers. And one of, again, thinking about sort of supporters and being flexible, we've also worked, for example, with families where they've come on the course like a carer and a supporter as well. If there was a good relationship, which is a big if, between foster carers and both parents, there's absolutely no reason why we shouldn't work with both. Haven't done that yet. I'd love to.
We see that sometimes, though. We see that sometimes when the parents are working with the foster carer really well. But I guess it shouldn't. If you're teaching MVR to a foster carer, I'm always advocating in my cases that foster carers and parents should have similar interventions or training, so that when the parents turn up for contact, they are not saying, right, if you behave like that, I'm going to take your phone from you. Foster carer has been using a completely different approach.
Absolutely, yes. And it's certainly one of the things that is also thinking about schools, which, you know, when you've got a school that's helpful, that's amazing. And very often that's not the case. So if we can work with a school, and I'm thinking of one school in particular, social worker who's helping us to work with quite a large school to see if they can think about NVR for the sort of school that just happens to have quite a lot of adopted children in it. So if we can work with them, then there can be some kind of communication between school and home. And it's exactly what you're saying, so that the child doesn't get totally confused by these different interventions.
Then I have another question from Anna Shefford, who's a member of the family team here, and she asks really about timescales. And in our family court, we allegedly have a 26-week notice. It's very rarely ever, but all cases are supposed to conclude. They don't. One have a 26-week case. So timescales.
Is it? It's a bit like the other question we had. It is a question of a piece of string on what's happening. Sometimes you see really quick change. Sometimes parents are really struggling with some of the really things that we want to put in place really quickly, say the de-escalation. For all sorts of reasons, it may not make sense to them, or actually it's a really exhausting thing to do, and they kind of managed to get so far with the escalations, and then it's a bit of a struggle. It also depends on how much energy and the parent has to be able to focus on parenting, because they're not just parents. People have very different, very busy lives. They could be caring for all sorts of other people. There may be lots of other children involved. Very often parents are themselves, struggling with their own illness, their own mental health, that kind of thing. So I'm afraid I'm going to go back to the piece of string.
And their own trauma.
And their own trauma.
So that's a very quick question. So it's a difficult one, but for you to answer, I appreciate that. But what if you have a young person who is refusing to engage with professionals?
That's fine. I have never met any of the children whose parents out. I don't need them. I'm just working with the parents. And that's in fact, actually, that's where NVR can be really helpful, because we never ask the child to engage. They're invited to engage because of their parents engaging with them.
And I guess part of the child or young person refusing to engage is the way they're dealing with their trauma. They're shut down, and it's a bit like them absconding or running away. They don't want people telling them what to do. So it's another one of those behaviours. All right. Thank you. Bye bye to you, everyone.